Hello, it's Friday morning, and that means Garland Nixon and Joti Brar are on the air, and we've got lots of important things to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, it's Friday morning, and I've been got up a little late, so I've been scurrying about trying to prepare for our show. But fortunately for you, I wasn't able to do anything to prepare, so I won't be able to talk much. It'll all be Joti, and you'll hear her brilliance. All right, let's start here. Here's a question. I'm interested to see how you're going to answer this question, Joti, because we use this term, the ruling elite, right? And we talk about classes and societies, but the ruling elite, I'll put it like this. I think of the way the U.S. sees itself when the U.S. talks about the rules-based international order, right? Give me a second here and I'll explain so our audience will know where I'm going. And the U.S. will say the rules-based international order. And what they mean is the world is a hierarchy, but the U.S. is above that hierarchy, because within that hierarchy, there are rules, right? But the U.S. is the judge, jury, and advocate of the rules. The U.S. writes the rules, decides who's obeying the rules, who's not, punishes those who it says aren't obeying the rules, changes the rules upon its whim, but does not have to adhere to the rules. So they're not really rules. They're really the whims of the U.S. And they say that they're rules to dupe everyone else and to maintain control, because people wouldn't be as accepting of the so-called order if they really had to accept that this is just some tyrant saying do whatever I want when I want you to do it. Okay, I see that as a great metaphor for the ruling elite. That's kind of the way things seem to me with the ruling elite. But people will say, well, who are they? Do they all go to the same schools? Such as there's a great book called Voltaire's Bastards that gets into that, how they're trained in their elite institutions. Are they members of, the CFR, the Bilderberg group, etc.? We hear all of these things. I want to understand from your perspective, when we talk about the ruling elite, who do you see them? Who are we talking about? How would you describe this shady and shadowy group of evil fiends?
Thanks, Garland. Well, I really stand by Lenin's definition of what happens to capitalism in the era of monopoly, which is that you get a ever smaller, tighter group of people who he described as a financial oligarchy. There's this historical process where there's a steady concentration through history as capitalism develops of capital, and free capitalism develops. Capital becomes so big that it becomes monopoly. And the people at the top of these monopolistic production forces become interconnected with the people at the top of the banking system, and the banks move from being kind of middlemen in between financial transactions to being kind of in control of and having an overview of all financial activity. And so as capitalism develops into monopoly, industrial capital and banking capital merge, and it's the bankers who are sort of on top, because they see everything, and they've got this huge control over all aspects of the economy. Who can develop, who can have a loan, and they know the ins and outs of everybody's business, right? So there's a reason why we now live in a world where we know that bankers run everything. Well, Lenin and the people who were studying the development of imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century pointed this out, that the development of monopoly and the development of capitalism into imperialism had created this tiny ruling class, this ruling elite, that was made up of that constituted a financial oligarchy. And Lenin described that very well in his book. And you say, sort of, who are they? Well, the ruling class itself is very small, but it needs a machinery to keep itself in power, keep its system going. So it has an extensive kind of layer beneath it, which I sort of call the Mandarin class, right? And very often the Mandarin class is drawn from kind of junior members of the ruling elites' families, you know, because there are many of them who aren't, at the top of the fortune pile, and from families who have kind of historically served them and are at the very top of the upper middle class. So they may not be ruling class themselves, but they live, a life very similar to the ruling class and mix with them and serve them. So if you look at the people who run the system, who most of them are in the Mandarin class, they're not in the ruling class, because the ruling class can outsource almost every function to somebody on a salary. But if you look at the ruling class, the people who are running things, running the system, you'll see how very interlocked they are. Now, they do go to the same schools. They go to the same universities and the same university colleges. They go to the same clubs. Inside Oxford and Cambridge, there are special clubs that you have to be from the right family or have the right amount of money to have access to. You can't just roll up and say, I'd like to join the Bullingdon Club, please. I'd like to join the, I don't even know the names of them, right? They have clubs that we don't know about. They have places where they network. And, you don't have to consider that a conspiracy. It's a historical reality. That's the way that the ruling class operates and has always operated, as long as, this type of a ruling class has been in existence, which is, in Britain, we've had a ruling class that sent its sons to Oxford and Cambridge, and Eton and Harrow before that, for a few hundred years. So this is a kind of well-established system, certainly in Britain. And I think in France, they have a similar system. I'm sure in the USA, they have built themselves exactly the same type of a system, right? And it can be almost invisible to people who don't know about it, because they live in a completely different universe to the rest of us. You can get into Oxford or Cambridge as a state school student and never really interact with or come apart from, in a lecture hall, never really know socially what those people do or where they hang out, because, you're not going to be invited to the functions that they're going to. So they have a training ground. They have a bubble that they live in. Might sound like a stupid little side anecdote, but I'm just going to tell it to you. I was at just a kind of Christmassy gathering in London this year, and I met a very nice couple, Black British, one of them of Caribbean ancestry and one of them of African ancestry, right? Both Christians, both professionals. I think one of them was a doctor, one of them was a teacher, so well-educated, kind of middle class, respectable. They're Christians and they go to a church. Their church, for whatever reason, the church they were going to was a very kind of privileged church. And it ran a holiday camp. But kids who didn't go to private school were not allowed to go to the holiday camp. And when they asked why not, they were told because the parents of the children who go to private school don't want their children to mix with ordinary children who could be from who knows what background, right? So this church is running special, holiday for privileged children, and in such a way that those children never have to rub shoulders with someone undesirable. That's the church. And I thought that was very telling, the way in which the ruling class and the Mandarin class keep their whole world separate from the masses in order to not be kind of poisoned by,
Wow,
association. So that's an interesting little side anecdote. But if you look at the interlocking nature of, what Lenin pointed out, and which you can still see is very true today, is the way that directorships of the most important economic institutions and financial and cultural institutions in the country are interlocking. So if you just look at like one bank, so you look at Barclays Bank in Britain, which is a very big, important monopoly institution. If you look at the members of its board, you'll see that its directors also hold posts as directors on a whole load of other massive multinational corporations, right? In BP, in the Laval Group in Switzerland, in Quilter, which is like a wealth management firm, in all kinds, in BT, in, Alliance, that's a Swiss group, in all kinds of investment banks and other big industrial companies, right? And they will hold posts on important bodies which are supposed to kind of set the rules and decide on the environment of business. So they'll have posts on groups like the Bank Policy Institute, the 100 Group, the Institute of International Finance, all this type of stuff. The Cabinet Office Board, right? That's government, yeah. The International, I can't even say this, the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, right? They are deciding on the ethics for accountants, right? The people who run the biggest bank in the world. Yeah.
Or the lack of ethics for the accountants.
Right. The Institute for Government, right? They're on the investment committee of the Open Society Foundation's Economic Justice Program, whatever that means. And if you look at it, when I looked at this a few years ago, the chairman of Barclays was someone called Nigel Higgins. He was also the chairman of Sadler's Wells, which is Britain's one of Britain's big cultural institutions, the ballet company. And one of his colleagues was the treasurer for the Scout Association. And another one was president of Queen's College in Cambridge. So you see how they have this kind of, between them, they have a kind of total control over all the institutions of what we think of as culture, the state, anything that touches people's lives or creates the environment in which business is done and people operate.
Wow. Okay. So that's the ruling elite. The courtiers, the hangers on, there's a group, I think, I used to I was into old fashioned horror movies, vampires, werewolves, zombies. That's old school. None of these new possession people. No, I like the good old fashioned, I grew up with good old school monsters. Okay. The vampire had an assistant. Always had an assistant who the vampire, they give him a little bit of power. Didn't have the quite power. They even had movies, The Vampire's Assistant, right? And they would have certain powers above a normal person. And they would aspire that one day in these movies, the vampire would bite them and turn them into a full vampire. And then they'd have all the vampire issues, right? And I've always felt like the ruling elite have that they always maintain that. A class that is there. What do you think about that analogy?
Absolutely. When we have a ruling class which is so incredibly wealthy, the one thing they can do is bribe people. They will find people who are willing to sell themselves, sell the interests of humanity for their own personal advancement. And, whatever stories they tell themselves, that's what they do. They sell their souls to the devil. And that's a Faustian pact that's, we got a name for it because Faust wrote about it, several hundred years ago, right? We call it a Faustian pact, right? Sell your soul for the devil for rewards. Now, so what are you giving up? In the Faustian pact, you say, okay, my eternal soul is yours, devil. What does that mean? That means in perpetuity, I will be suffering. But right now, I'm going to get my heart's desire. Well, that's exactly the exchange, isn't it? Because these people sell their souls. They sell their ability to think well of themselves in a meaningful way and not a how much am I worth kind of a way. They may feel like they've done something terribly clever to get one up on everybody, to play, to win the battle of competition that we are told is life. But they are selling humanity down the river to do it, and they do it knowingly, So that's a pretty horrific bargain as far as I'm concerned, And I may not believe in eternal torture, but I don't believe that there's any way to be a full human being on the basis of making this bargain, right? So yes, they do that. I think a really fantastic example of somebody like that is our former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. He came from the Mandarin class. He went to private school and, was jolly well educated and all of that. But he wasn't from the ruling class. He used his time he said all the right things to get elected and get into power, power, getting to number 10, he was a willing servant of the super rich, did anything they wanted from him as long as he got paid enough. And he made sure through his time in office, he was making the right connections to make lots and lots of money later. He made sure that he was setting himself up for all the right directorships and positions as soon as he was out of office. You know, now he has the Tony Blair Foundation. He's always being given, you know, he gets insane amounts of money to go and speak to other people who want to make money. You know, he facilitates imperialist looting around the world still today because of the connections he made when he was in government. So he worked out a way to just really cold-blooded kind of calculation of how much can I make for myself and my family through this position and the future positions I think I'm going to get from it. And you know, you can see him sort of buying his family a leg up on the social hierarchy, that they got a bit closer to being really in the ruling class. They're still not, but, you know, closer. They're worth a fair bit now, a hell of a lot more than they were worth in the beginning. When he went into Downing Street, he had a house in Islington, which, you know, these days a house in Islington is worth a couple of million, but, you know, it was just a house. You know, at the end of it, they had like estates, right? And I'm sure his fortune continues to grow pretty exponentially.
Right. Let me ask you this. The original metaphor I used was a world hierarchy, that basically the U.S. and Britain have tried to transform the world into that system, using the U.S. and Britain seeing themselves as part of the U.S. empire. Maybe I've often said that I think the ruling class in England see the U.S. kind of like, there was a movie. I mean, there was a famous song, and they say, you got the brawn, I got the brains. Let's make some money, right? I think they see the U.S. as the knuckle dragging apes that they send in to punch you, but that they're really smart and they can really manipulate this. I look at it more like a pet werewolf. Werewolves don't listen well. You know what I mean? You got a pet werewolf. If he gets the opportunity, he's going to tear you to shreds the same as he's teared anybody else to shreds. And to fool yourself into thinking that you can control, you know, or a mad dog, he's going to bite the nearest leg. If it happens to be yours, it's going to be yours. And now well, let me ask you this. How do you see the relationship? I've been working to try to, I guess, politically, economically, and philosophically define the relationship between the UK, who lost the grip on this big empire and then latched onto the US. How do you see that relationship?
Yeah, it's quite a weird one, isn't it? You know, I think you're right. You know, Britain was the preeminent imperialist power until World War One. After World War II, you know, its decline was marked and rapid, and continues to this day. But of course, Britain is still home to a huge pile of finance capital. So it doesn't have the military might any longer to back that up. It doesn't have the physical control of a monopolistic control of whole areas of the world to back that up, because it's been ousted in step by step, place by place. It's been replaced as the main extractor of wealth by the USA. I was talking to a Kenyan comrade recently. He was saying, you know, there was a process of democratization of Kenya's post-liberation democracy. And it was around 2000-ish, I think. I forget dates. But during this process of democratization, which was very heavily supported by the USA, what happened was the main looter of Kenya's wealth moved from being Britain to the USA. Britain is still there. You know, it's like in West Africa. You know, France will carry on being there, I'm sure, for a while. But, you know, the Americans are definitely trying to reposition themselves as number one looter, right? And you see this all over the world. You saw it, of course, very importantly, crucially, you saw it in the Middle East. You saw it with Israel. Up until the Suez War, Israel was Britain's project.
Right, right.
After Suez, Israel became America's project with British support. And Britain, from that moment really in the world, Britain was obviously and openly the junior partner to US imperialism. Britain was bankrupted really by 2 world wars and the national liberation movements combined. Really dealt massive blows to Britain, and to sort of rehabilitate its economy, it relied very much on loans and help from the USA. And of course, the USA, as you say, is not a pet. The USA is an imperialist power also. It was a rising imperialist power, and it wanted British, French, German imperialism to be stabilized, and Japanese, in order to stabilize the whole system of imperialism against the rising tide of socialism. But of course, it wanted to be on the top. So in each one of those places, it set up a system with a kind of semi-dependency. None of those powers ever regained the military strength they had had before World War I. None of them ever gained the ability to be peer competitors to the USA. They have all been allowed on sufferance to remain as imperialist powers, as junior partners in a global imperialist system, which is actually, although it looks so strong, it's in many ways faltering. Economically, it's in the kind of crisis that it doesn't have a way out of except for war. And while war on one hand can be seen as a way to reinvigorate markets, on the other hand, it does bankrupt the powers involved and open the eyes of the people and create all kinds of other problems. During World War I and World War II, the USA mainly sat on the side, right, and let everybody else wear themselves out and use up all of their resources and go bankrupt. And then it came in and took advantage of that situation. Now it's the USA leading the war charge. There's no imperialist power sat on the side waiting to bail everybody out at the end of that. But anyway, we can come back to that. You were asking me, sorry, I went off on one. You were asking me about Britain and the USA. So Britain has been very much a junior partner. I think, ever since Churchill, they've talked about this special relationship. And what they, I think, mean by that, from what I can work out reading between the lines, and I'm not the best soothsayer, from what I can work out, what they mean is we have special knowledge of how empires work because we've been doing it the longest. We're the best at spying. We're the best at subterfuge. We're the best at divide and rule. We're really, really good at that, right? We're really good at working out how to get into the cracks between people, how to tell people why some of their problems is because of this group over here. This group blames this group, get people fighting with one another. The British are definitely past masters at that. And they are past masters at subterfuge operations, right? And so they've kind of tutored the world. I mean, the Nazis openly said that they learned a lot of their propaganda skills from the British, right? And I'm sure all sorts of other skills too, how you put the workers down, how you are ruthless in pursuit of your aims. The British are brilliant at presenting themselves as terribly nice and very considerate, but the British ruling class, for all its civilized veneer and the nice suits and ties that they wear, they are utterly, utterly ruthless in waging the class war. And they are past masters at how you present that, how you frame your motivations. And I think they feel that they still are the best at all those things, and that America, on some special level, needs their expertise, their ability to do dirty tricks, their ability to do propaganda, their ability to be subtle, and they sort of look at the Americans as a bit like the aristocracy used to look at the bourgeoisie, like new money, like these upstarts who don't really have any culture. They haven't been doing this for long enough to really understand the rules of the game. And we wrote the rules of the game, by the way, so that I think there's still a bit of this mentality floating around now. We're getting really into the realms of the psychiatry, which is not my field. Psychology, I should say.
You're doing a pretty good job, but good people.
This is the impression I get from what I see and what I read. But economically, we have to recognize Britain is still an imperialist country. You can tell that because of the way that so much of its economy is based around servicing the people who service the people who suck the loot out of the world. The main economic driver of our economy is the square mile, as we call it, the City of London. The City of London is a self-policing district, has its own police force, right? Separate from the Metropolitan Police. It's its own laws, right? It's a special place where people do business, but the special business they're engaged in is basically laundering money that has come from, looting the wealth of the rest of the world. The productive activity of workers all around the world, is channeled into the City of London. And so people who work in the square mile get huge wages because they're part of this machinery of looting the world. And then there are people in layers around them who are paid to service them in various ways. And so much of our economy is distorted by this. Like there's this resentment amongst workers in every other part of the country against London and the southeast, because there's such a warped relationship, and in terms of, jobs, wages, everything is all in London. But if you're an ordinary person, living in London can be a nightmare because the wages you need are so high to survive there, right? And as far as ordinary workers are concerned, they're not really seeing these great benefits of London. But what it seems to people outside of London is all the resources of the country go to London. They're the only ones, for example, who have a functioning transport system. London transport is pretty good. But outside of London, every adult has to have a car or you're stuffed. Right. So there is this kind of, and they create this sort of feeling that it's about London and Londoners, when in fact it's really about the warping of the economy that happens through imperialist looting of the world. And Lenin described this. He talked about how there were places in Switzerland and Nice, or south of France, and in the south of England, where nobody was doing anything productive. And all the people were living on rents. He called it a rentier economy, and rents meaning, cutting. He talked about coupon clippers, people who were just living off the interest, basically, of money invested through city institutions in some production somewhere else in the world. And they get enough money from the interest from their money being put to work somewhere in the world to live. And then they have a whole bunch of people around them who service them. And so this whole economy is totally distorted and has no connection with meaningful economic activity. Now, Lenin identified that as certain areas in different, you could start to see that happening. But now it's almost our entire economy you can look at that way. Margaret Thatcher famously celebrated that we have become a service economy, right? And nobody does a proper job anymore. And they said this is something really advanced. What it tells you is the very advanced stage of monopoly capitalism we've arrived at, whereby, British monopoly capital is sucking up so much of the loot of the world that it actually sustains a huge proportion of the British population who don't produce new wealth, but just are in rings of service to one another. So we're still an imperialist country. And as imperialists, the British imperialists, I hate it when people say we and they're like identifying themselves with these people. There's nothing to do with me. So there's the working class and there's the ruling class, and there's no we between those two groups. But the ruling class is an imperialist ruling class, and it needs to have for its ability to keep investing and looting the world, it needs to retain technological and military dominance. It's the gun behind the back that backs up the ability of these people to go everywhere and impose their conditions, right? Because monopoly looting relies on you being able to enforce your conditions on people, and they can't stand up against you. Now, some of that is achieved just by the power and the weight of your capital. You can shape so many of the conditions by the power of that capital, and you can just overwhelm all other business, right? But countries in the era of national liberation can put up barriers to that and put up rules and say no. So one thing is to come and overwhelm the local environment and prevent countries putting up barriers that are effective. The other one is to have control of so many levers of the rest of the economy and trade and international activity that the price for trying to put up barriers against international financial control of your economy is too high. And the other thing is to be able, in the last resort, to enforce your diktat by means of war.
Well,
Now,
I'm gonna read an article. I mean, just one statement from you from Vladimir Putin's speech. And when I read that, I'm like, yeah, I know why they hate Putin and they want to take him out. This is one statement. He had a speech yesterday. He said, "The state's true purpose is to help the people." I can imagine that the ruling elite in British, this is not he's going to follow up on it. It's right, it's wrong, it's good or bad. But for a leader to make a statement like that, when we both know that the state's true purpose is to represent the ruling elite in the eyes of the imperialist. To me, this is drawing on what he's saying. As I said, I'm not taking a position whether he meant it or didn't mean it. That's irrelevant. The fact of the matter is the ruling elite in this side of the pond heard it, right? That, to me, when they hear that, cements to them, oh my God, he's saying terrible, I'm sorry about that. He's saying terrible things that can't be tolerated. We don't want people to hear that. Anyway, your thoughts on a statement like that, what that says to you?
It's really interesting, isn't it? There's a few things that spring to my mind. One is, of course, that all rulers of bourgeois states will say things like that, including in ours. The state's here to help everybody, but our experience is very different. And when people say it these days, they're kind of greeted with, rolled eyes and cynicism because they haven't experienced the state trying to help them in quite a long time. What you see with the difference between imperialist and anti-imperialist leaders is if you are leading a country that's standing up to imperialism, there is no way you can do that without big majority backing of your people. And what that means is you have to deliver for your people something. It might not be everything. It might not be everything they would get under socialism. I have a lot of comrades, of course, who are still in mourning, as of course we all must be in many ways, for the USSR. And they hate Vladimir Putin, President Putin, because he represents to them the death of the USSR and, capitalism replacing it in Russia, and the death of all of the things, the great things that socialism brought to the people. But from further away, looking at the whole global picture, I see something a little bit different, which is that President Putin, just like President Raisi in Iran, is it still Raisi? Sorry.
Raisi, yes. President
Raisi in Iran, President Xi Jinping in China. Well, China's a bit different because it's not because it's socialist, but like President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, like President Maduro in Venezuela. If you look at all these popular anti-imperialist leaders, by facing imperialism and exerting their sovereignty, they draw the ire and the attack of imperialism on them. And that attack is military, it's intelligence, it's diplomatic, it's especially economic. And it's very hard to face up against that unless you have the backing of your people. And in order to get the backing of your people, you have to deliver things to your people. And so the more that Russia strives for sovereignty against the West, the more it has to make sure it is also delivering things to its people so they feel mobilized and motivated to stand with their government against imperialism. And so what I really see in President Putin's statement there is a reflection of the fact that the reality of being an anti-imperialist government is you better be delivering some decent things for your people. And it's a kind of a manifesto, isn't it? It's a reminder. It's also, I think, in the Russian context, there's something else too, which is Russia's not any old capitalist country. Russia used to be the USSR. Russian capitalism in the modern era has inherited the wealth the technological advancement, the educational level, the cultural level of a socialist society, a very powerful and advancing socialist society. So it's also a reminder of something. This is a statement that the people fundamentally still, I think, believe across the Soviet Union. They had experience of a state that really was built to serve the people and whose aim was to serve the people. So when President Putin makes a statement like that, he's also chiming with that chord with the people, where that is what they believe the state is for, because that is what their state was for quite some time. That same level of cynicism that we have towards the statements by our rulers is tempered by that historical experience, I think.
Well, there is, I think, in that speech, I think we should touch on a couple things. I think it's critical. There were some legacy things there that I found interesting. I've been watching what has happened as Russia has been attacked on all fronts by imperialism. They have been forced to resort to some of the things necessary to bring about the dynamics, particularly which you are speaking of, such as, in order to produce the war material that they need for the Ukraine conflict, where in the US it's a neoliberal capital, yay, let's make a missile that costs $1 and sell it to the government for 10 million. They had to revert to our, the things that we make, the war material is going to be state run. These are going to be paid. The state has to do this. It's the only way administratively and physically that we can do it for the cost that we need at the volume that we can need. They reverted to they reopened factories, things that they had during the Soviet Union. And of course, there are still people who are around, who are involved in this process, who were there during the Soviet Union, who were actually part of that. Additionally, President Putin said, this is not to blow his horn or not, this is a discussion of the speech. He mentioned, yes, we need the people to be healthy, build more gyms and athletic clubs. Who does that sound like? You know what I mean? We're going to build more gyms. We're going to build more athletic clubs. We're going to do things to make it easier for families to have children who get whether it's tax breaks or financial assistance, things of that nature. I heard the attack of imperialism on the Soviet Union, on Russia, pushing Vladimir Putin to say, here's what we need to do to counter that. But he knew what those things were. A lot of countries attacked by imperialism, they'd be flustered. What do we do? What do we do? How do we address this? But instead, it was, we already know what we need to do when we're attacked by imperialism. Gather round. We're going to do this, 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 this. He didn't say we're going to go back to being the USSR, but it was like, if you have a formula that has worked in the past to bring the people together, to make the people healthier, stronger, families healthier, stronger. He pushed back. We need traditional families because we need to have more. He was straightforward. We need traditional families because we need to have more kids, things of that nature. Your thoughts on that part of I don't know how much you covered the speech, but I threw some of the things out at you. Your thoughts on that kind of stuff and how that fits in this conversation.
I haven't had the opportunity to read the whole speech, so I'll
you should.
Any comments with that. I will try to. Just responding to the things that you've been saying there, Garland, I think there's a couple of really interesting things that stand out to me. Number one is that something I've noticed already about the military production, because of course we've been paying attention to that because of the ongoing SMO, which is now 2 years old, that how quickly Russia reverted to essentially the Soviet model that enabled them to win World War II. And I've heard Scott Ritter, who's on your show quite often, talking about how sane the Russian arms production industry is, and how it thinks ahead, and how when you see a Russian arms factory, it has space to ramp up and down production as needed, and it has skilled workers in the vicinity ready to come in when they're needed. This is not a Russian kind of brilliance. This is the Soviet Union. This is this is a planned economy. That's what a planned economy looks like. That is how the Soviet Union built its war industries in the 1930s, precisely to prepare for the need to ramp up when attack came, which they knew at some point it would. Of course, many of the things that fed into that no longer exist, but you're referencing the fact that the Russians are recognizing we need to rebuild not just the arms industry, but all the things we had that enabled us to win World War II. Now, that was an educated people. It was a fit and healthy people, very much a fit and healthy people, right? The Soviet Union was very proud of how kind of well-rounded its young people were. They had a great education and, they pursued arts and culture. But they did things like they set up loads and loads of parachute clubs in the 1930s. And little plane clubs and things at collective farms, so people could learn in their free time, as well as being tractor drivers who turned out to be brilliant at driving tanks once the war started. They were, having fun, learning how to fly planes and jump out of air, jump with parachutes. So, they did lots and lots of physical activity that made them strong, but it also made them able to fight modern wars, which, of course, Russia in the pre-Soviet period had not been able to do well. They'd had lots and lots of people who were very, very poor and who were thrown into the trenches with no training and no equipment and no nothing, to just, try to win by force of numbers, which is how NATO has been using its Ukrainian forces, right? Just to try to, if you throw enough people into this trench, will I win a battle? And that's very much the kind of the imperialist approach to people is that. But the Soviet approach was, no, we want healthy, strong, able people who are mentally motivated to defend the motherland. And who don't see that they're just, with the Soviet Union, they weren't even just defending the motherland. They were defending socialism. They were defending the base of the world revolution. And they knew it, and that was another kind of motivating factor. Tragically, I think one of the worst things that came out of World War II was that probably the flower of the young communist generation, the ones who were the most motivated to defend socialism, were the ones who died in the highest numbers, because they were the first to the front, and Russia lost so many people. So it really lost, a kind of priceless contingent of young, motivated people there. But what you're saying to me about what you're hearing from President Putin very much has echoes of the Soviet era of what we heard from Stalin in terms of, the need to build the country in every respect, to make it strong because attack is coming. He predicted that one of the things that the West likes to pretend is that Stalin was an idiot and a coward, and he didn't know that World War II was coming. But in fact, exactly 10 years, almost to the day before World War II hit Russia through Operation Barbarossa, which was 1941, in 1931, Stalin went to a group of business executives, I think it was, and he said to them, "We have got 10 years to catch up, or they will destroy us. We have to catch up. We have to up the tempo of our industrialization, collectivization. We've got to make sure we're as strong as we can possibly be on every front, because, the imperialists are not going to just leave us alone to develop at our own rate. Right? We have to technologically catch up. We have to make ourselves into a strong modern industrial nation, and a well-armed one as well." So yeah, and it's been noticeable ever since the Maidan coup in Ukraine brought the fascists into power in 1914. I think when Crimea voted to go back to Russia, and that robbed NATO and the CIA of their prized asset. Right? They thought when they got Ukraine, they were getting Crimea, and they immediately lost it. And they were just so incandescent about that. And, that really did for the relationship, I think. It was already declining, but it really was kind of the end of the relationship between the West and Russia. But when that happened, the West implemented sanctions, didn't it, against Russia? Say, look what we can do more as well, but by the way, this is what we can do to you. And from that moment on, you saw this steady shift in the Russian government's focus economically on revitalizing sectors of the economy it had allowed to die. It had allowed the imperialists to get their way of deindustrializing, populating the countryside, kind of bankrupting a lot of the local businesses in favor of multinational agribusiness. And they saw that, how vulnerable that made them. Now, the thing is, the Russian people used to be the Soviet Union. They used to be strong in every single sphere. So as well as they have a memory of achieving those things, they have a cultured and educated population. They have a mentality of self-sufficiency. And if the government says, I think we should invest in agriculture, like nobody's going to argue with them, and so they did start to reinvest in the agricultural sector and start to look at the areas of their economy where they were vulnerable and put state-directed investment. They didn't rely on the much vaunted market to fix these problems. They said, if you want to face imperialism, and imperialism looks like it's coming for us, then you better make sure you can survive. And we have experience of how to do that. So you're right. What we're seeing is echo after echo of the history of the Soviet Union and the strengths of the Soviet Union being brought into play in order to face the imperialists.
You know what's interesting? As no one knows that more than the ruling elite in the West, because when they use these terms, Putin wants to revive the Soviet Union. They specifically use those words. It's because they understand that the Soviet Union wasn't just a person in Stalin. It wasn't just whatever they want to use. They understand the intricacies of the Soviet Union and why it was able to thwart them repeatedly in Africa and Latin America, why it was able to withstand various attacks in all realms, economic, cultural, diplomatic, etc. And they are saying he is heating up. He is turning back up the facets in the Russian Federation. He's saying during the Soviet Union, we needed this to protect ourselves from the imperialists. Let's turn these things back up. We know how to do it. We still have the people who are trained in these things, and the people in our society would be fine with us doing this because, hey, it's going to benefit them. And so let's turn them back up. And the ruling elite over here looked over and they said, crap. He's turning those things up again. And they started saying he's trying to revitalize the Soviet Union. But the people that didn't understand that didn't really know what they were saying. I think they were speaking to each other, saying the anti-imperialist machine is growing, building these force fields for protection. But they saw it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that President Putin himself is in this interesting position of representing Russian capital, which doesn't want the return of socialism, but at the same time is at the head of a state whose strength rests in its socialist development and legacy. And that socialist development and legacy has to be harnessed and mobilized to effectively face down the imperialists, and increasingly has to be as the war hots up and the confrontation gets more aggressive and more threatening and goes on for longer. You've got to mobilize you've got to mobilize the whole population. They've got to feel engaged with the war effort and that it's worth, developing, focusing their attention on and putting society's resources into. So they've got to feel patriotic towards the country. When was the last time the Soviet people felt really, really patriotic? It was during the Great Patriotic War, right? And to revive those sentiments, there's a whole lot of stuff that comes with it. And there's this difficult, I think, balancing act almost for President Putin that, he will regularly denounce Lenin in particular and sort of try to make out that the current problems being faced by Russia, say vis-a-vis Ukraine, for example, are because of something that Lenin and Stalin did wrong in the early days of forming the Soviet Union. It's total nonsense. But you can see the contradiction of his position there, because by reviving the memory, the legacy, the motivations of people through some of this image, he's forced to use. He makes speeches that sound like Stalin sometimes, and he is deliberately pushing those buttons that connect with people, but that also revives people's love for what they had under socialism, which no capitalist country can provide all of those things, no matter how nicely it treats its people, relatively speaking, because capitalist production creates inequality and poverty and unemployment and all the things we know, no matter how kindly it's run. There's a basic problem at the heart of the system that you can't overcome within the confines of the system. But you're right, when the West looks at how President Putin is mobilizing the people and how the Russian ruling class is making use, or the Russian government is making use of Soviet mechanisms and planning mechanisms in order to face imperialism, it absolutely, I think, terrifies and enrages them in equal measure. Terrifies them because those are things which work. Enrages them because these are avenues of profit they are being denied. Everything which is run in the public sector is an affront to capital that's desperate to find somewhere to make a profit. And that's a sin that they never forgave Stalin for, and they will never forgive Vladimir Putin for either, although Vladimir Putin is not Stalin.
Interesting. The other thing is, when President Putin had given a speech, I think a day or so before, Sergei Lavrov gave a speech, and a lot of it was about the global South. What the other interesting part is the kind of recognition right now of the Russian leadership that, and again, what are they doing? They're going back to that Soviet legacy, that they represent the global South. They're talking about how, look, we're the global majority. They've gone from, hey, can we become a part of NATO? Can we join Europe to, okay, that's over. That ain't going to work. That's obvious, right? So now they're saying the global majority. Look, China, we're here. Latin America, Africa, Sergei Lavrov, he's always touring Latin America. He's touring former colonial powers, saying and empowering them, giving them stuff, helping them to grow, free wheat to Africa, saying, and so we see Russia is really reviving their relationship with what we call the global South, and China also. They're recognizing we're not welcome in Europe, we're not liked in the West, and let's all get huddle together like puppies. We've got to all huddle together to be strong. Your thoughts on that other part of what's happening with Russia, and of course China, what have you? But right now I'm talking about Russia, the reviving their relationship with the former colonial powers.
Yes, I don't really like the term global South. I know it's got very common currency, but I feel like it's introduced by people who just don't want to say imperialism. And over my lifetime, I've seen a succession of these terms that come in and out of fashion to basically avoid saying imperialism and oppression. But yes, when you look at the mass of the world, the non-imperialist countries, the oppressed and underdeveloped world, and of course the socialist world. So we have, they're both in the same camp. They're both in the camp of anti-imperialism. They have one which is developing out of its position of being oppressed and dominated via socialist mechanisms, and then you have, the vast majority of still which are still capitalist, but subject to the control and domination by the imperialist world. And you're absolutely right. As more and more countries find themselves in the crosshairs of imperialism, more and more of them realize that their only hope for survival is together. As soon as you start, and it's just the same as, it's exactly analogous to the situation of the working class and the ruling class in any individual country. As an individual worker against the state machinery and control of your oligarchic ruling class, you are nobody. You have nothing. But you start putting the power of those workers next to one another, you realize all the power's actually with you, because you're the ones who make everything. You're the ones who do everything. The ruling class gives orders and pays money, but fundamentally, they don't do any of the things that need doing to keep themselves in power. They have it all sourced out to other people. And, you know, one of the fundamental messages my party tries to bring to the working class in Britain and around the world is the power is with you. If you refuse to cooperate with this activity, it can't carry on. You know, the message that we have about Gaza, for example, is not, you know, write to your MP and beg him to have a vote about a ceasefire. It is, do not let anything British be used. A British person, a British factory, a British piece of food, a British weapon, a British anything, a British dock that is going to help Israel in any way. We have the power to do that. We can refuse all the related activities. We can refuse to join in with them because workers are the ones who do everything and make everything. We're the ones who produce the wealth, right? We just don't have an understanding of that because a big part of the machinery of control is mental, right? It's the narrative, it's the propaganda war, which is, you know, why you and I are here talking today, right? To try and push back against the overwhelming propaganda narrative that keeps us isolated, weak, atomized, and in our place. So this necessity for the people, the countries of the oppressed and anti-imperialist world to come together is something that they are steadily waking up to. You know, there was, you know, we've seen it before. We did see the growth of that, in particular after World War II, when the Soviet Union was joined by a growing camp of socialist countries. And when all those socialist countries, the Soviet Union, China, they were all giving help to national liberation movements all over the world. And that started right after the October Revolution. You know, despite the fact that the Soviet Union, or the Russia and then the early Soviet Union, inherited a situation that followed, you know, years of war where their economies were totally ravaged and bankrupted, and they were in a very difficult situation. One of the first things they did in the early days of the Soviet Union was to set up the University of the Toilers of the East. What was that? It was a center to give education to people struggling to lead national liberation movements all over the world. And they brought people in from every corner of the globe. They gave them a first-class education, and they gave them political and military training to be able to go back and lead national liberation movements successfully. So they learned everything you need to become a really good class-conscious anti-imperialist fighter. And they had a connection that meant they could get regularly, they could hold training camps on Soviet territory, they could get arms funneled to them from the Soviet Union. So this practical work of being a real base for the world anti-imperialist revolutionary movement was something the Soviet Union took very, very seriously. And you've seen, again, I think it's been particularly marked since 2014, and then gone up another level since 2022, with Russia revitalizing those connections it has, particularly with Russia, with Africa, where the Soviet Union gave so much active support to so many national liberation movements. And they have, now that Russia's given up on the idea, the Russian ruling class has for now given up on the idea that it's possible to join the club of civilized capitalist powers because it's a gang of imperialist looters and you're not an imperialist. This is what gives the lie to the idea that Russia's imperialist. They're not imperialist. They can't get invited to the club. The plan for Russia post USSR was to break it into pieces, dominate it, exploit it. They effectively turned Russia and all of Eastern Europe into colonies. Russia and all of the other former socialist countries went from being some of the most advanced societies on the planet to being, places for loot by international finance capital. A horrible, terrible tragedy and a come down for the people of those countries. They lost so much. But having stood up, Russia's a big country. And they realized, I think, the Russian bourgeoisie, once they didn't want to be a colony. Then they tried to be sovereign and sort of an equal in the world, and sort of, they'd had their brains filled with liberal crap, right? Definitely. And they had this idea that the way that the ruling class of the imperialist countries talk about their role in the world and their aims of, you know, being civilized and democratic had substance. Took them a long time to realize that it didn't have any substance and they weren't going to get to join the club. And as far as the West was concerned, they were supposed to be a colony, and just the West was only interested in dealing with compradors from Russia, people who would help them to loot the wealth of the country, not people who wanted to be treated as equals and engage in trade as opposed to facilitate looting, right? That's not how imperialism works. So once they started to realize that, you know, from 2014, and then again, like I said, accelerated 2022, they finally understood that where they've got to look to for their strategic depth to be able to stand up to imperialism is actually in standing with all the other countries that are targeted by imperialism. And the bigger the anti-imperialist bloc grows, the more solid it becomes. And this turn to Africa and this reinvigorating of the historic connections in particular there has been, I think, very significant and key to that. And again, it reawakens in people's minds this understanding of real internationalism, which is a socialist value, right? The internationalism that says no country or people is better than another country. We help one another out of a common interest in raising up all of humanity. This is not the way imperialists relate to other countries. They might use weasel words, but their aim is to subjugate them through debt and corruption and to control their economies and their polity in order to loot their wealth. You know, this is the relationship between an imperialist power and a subjugated people. It's not the relationship between the Soviet Union and the national liberation struggles, and it's not the relationship between Russia and the countries in Africa that it's now, you know, reinvigorating all over the world, in fact, that it's reinvigorating its ties with. And finally, the fact that Russia is building such solid connections now to the cornerstones of the socialist camp, which is China and the DPRK, I think is massively significant because, of course, since the Sino-Soviet split after Stalin's death, the rupture came quite soon in the socialist camp because of a change in leadership in the USSR that was essentially beginning the process of undermining socialism in the Soviet Union from Khrushchev's era onwards. We had this rupture in the socialist camp, which the USA got right into the middle of, you know, and took full advantage of. And it was a terrible, terrible blow to our movement as a whole, which it's still trying to recover from and understand, you know, and left all kinds of schisms and problems. And you know, the Khrushchevite line in the communist movement, the revisionist line, resulted in a communist movement which gave up on the class struggle in favor of kind of parliamentary, you know, just sort of insanity, just, you know, get involved in voting and tell people that the Labour Party or the Democratic Party or, you know, whatever the similar forces are in your country are going to somehow deliver something better. But the idea that what we need is not capitalism but socialism has sort of just got dropped by huge numbers of parties which followed Khrushchev's line. So, you know, we have all of that still to deal with. But what we are seeing is the consolidation of a big, solid, increasingly cohesive anti-imperialist camp based on the old Soviet internationalism, the socialist principles of internationalism, which are nobody bosses anybody about. We work together in our common interests and we help one another, and together we are strong.
Something that's important, I got to read a little bit from it. Sergei Lavrov had a speech, and the place that he gave the speech was called and you can go to the Orinoco Tribune. People should all go and read this. They have the full speech, and it's Russian Foreign Minister's remarks at the Forum of Supporters of the Struggle Against Modern Practices of Neocolonialism. Sounds like the kind of place we want to hear a speech from, doesn't it? All right. So let me get to this. Here's what he said. After the Soviet Union, I'm just going to take, well, you got to read the whole, everybody, you should read the whole thing. But he says, after the Soviet Union.
Put some links up, sorry, darling. You know, these articles you told us about, put some links up in your show description afterwards.
I'm going to have to do that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. He says, After the Soviet Union departed the world stage, the West began to impose its rules-based order. In fact, its undivided dominance in economics, finance, politics, and culture. The Golden Billion enthusiastically embarked on the neo-colonial development of the post-Soviet space, along with the countries of the global South and East. Abusing the trust of the world majority, the aggressive minority led by the United States improved colonial practices and did not hesitate to use force, as it happened in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and other countries of Asia and Africa. Now, what I'd like to do, I love to do this with any speech. I always like to go to the last. I don't even know what it is, but I'm going to read it. I always go to the last, the end of the speech, because everybody should read this. I really haven't read the whole speech, but he says, in conclusion, I would like to wish all participants in today's discussion productive work, new successes for the benefit of your countries, as well as universal prosperity and development based on mutual respect, indivisible security, and mutually beneficial cooperation. Now, that's a long speech. There's a lot of that to read and go over, and maybe we should do a show. Maybe really, I'd like to next week do a show and just take the speech by Putin and the speech by Lavrov, pull some parts of it and discuss them. I think that's a great idea for us to do. But at any rate, sure, based on those few things, your thoughts, if you have any.
So I think what's really significant about what you read to us there, Garland, is that the Russian government now, through Putin, through Lavrov, through all of its major public figures, are very clearly describing the process of recolonization of the former socialist bloc. And they're openly saying now, they want to turn us into colonies. That's how they see us. That's how they treat us. That's what they want our people and our lands to be. And that is why we are identifying ourselves and our interests with the oppressed and exploited majority around the world, because we also now have felt this pain and humiliation of being subject to this type of domination and this type of rampant looting of our wealth and this, horrific suffering it causes to the people. I mean, remember that the shock therapy that was meted out and prescribed for Russia after the fall of the USSR, no cushion, no welfare to soften the landing for the people. The death rates from suicide and alcoholism went through the roof. The numbers of people who died, from despair and poverty through the roof. The birth rate declined massively. So the numbers of people who were really lost in the population, I'm not sure if it's even really been properly counted, but it's, in the many millions of people in Russia lost their lives as a direct result of the economic shock therapy, which was essentially a colonization process and looting process of the huge wealth, the people's wealth of the Soviet Union, and this transfer of their wealth through the City of London, through the various, offshore, places where nobody knows how much money has gone where, through Wall Street, through Berlin Stock Exchange, and this, I think, like I said earlier, having failed to be accepted on the world stage that's dominated by these powers as equal, the Russian government and its spokespeople are finally coming to terms with the reality of what imperialism is, that it can't be, Minsk, 10 years of trying to make Minsk work, before they finally realize you can't negotiate with these people. You can't trust what they say. They'll shake your hand and look in your face, and we'll all have civilized suits and, have a nice cocktail after the meeting. And everybody will think that we had a jolly good meeting. And then you find out that they never, ever meant to implement one single aspect of what they talked to you about. It was all a cover for getting you not to do anything, while they were pushing their agenda and making what the Israelis like to call facts on the ground, right? Facts on the ground that you can't get away from, fortifying, turning Ukraine into a fortress, you know? Why? Why did Ukraine need to be a fortress? There was only one reason, and the Russians knew it. They were standing there watching while this was happening, like, but there's only one reason for Ukraine to be a fortress. We really need to talk about peace and security, guys, in this region. There's only one reason for Ukraine to be a fortress, you know, and they're pushing. Facts are developing on the ground, and there's Nazis, you know, filling up the government and terrorizing the people in the streets. And they're like, there's only one reason for doing this to Ukraine, and it's not looking good for Russia, right? You know, there comes a moment where all of this, you know, I've said this to you before, probably in Marxist philosophy, we talk about how small quantitative changes build up until you have a qualitative change. And I think what we saw with the launch of Russia's SMO was the final realization what all of these little things add up to. Some of them are not little, but you understand what I mean. You know, all of these quantitative things that they're understanding, and they see this and they see this, and they finally add them all up and go, we can't negotiate with these people, and if we don't stand up for ourselves now, it's going to be too late, and they're going to get what they want. You know, they are going to succeed in turning us into a broken colony, and dominating us and looting our people and our resources. And if we don't want that, we're going to have to learn the lessons. And what we're finding is through the course of the SMO, you know, in the beginning, there was a slight defensiveness because a lot of the world hadn't been standing where Russia was standing, where some of us observing were standing, and seeing the buildup that led to the launch of the SMO. And it was like the overwhelming imperialist propaganda made it look like it just came out of the blue. And somehow, maybe the imperialists were right that Russia, you know, Vladimir Putin woke up one day and was mental and just decided that he wanted to conquer some territory, right? And it was presented that way. And for people who hadn't been paying attention, it was hard to make sense of. And so there was a kind of defensive posture of Russia, spent a lot of time trying to reassure people that they're not aggressive, that they weren't pushing hard, that they were, you know, look, we're trying hard not to hit civilians. Look, these are the reasons we're doing this. And they were steadily sort of building this up. But over the course of that 2 years, people outside the West and the Western propaganda bubble, governments in particular all over the oppressed world, have been looking and following and watching and understanding, oh, yes, right, I get what this is all about now. And now I think the Russians feel much more confident to openly, you know, state their position and say, look, they want to turn us into a colony. They want to dominate us. They have only one way of operating. We stand with the anti-imperialist camp against that, and we should stand together.
If I could read it, do you have time? I want to read one more passage, and then we'll do one more. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, one more, and I think it's critical for what you're saying. He says, I'm just going to read this. In addition, the USSR's, this is Sergei Lavrov talking to the global majority, as it's referred to now. In addition, the USSR's inspiring example encouraged national liberation movements all over the world. Despite Western pressure, Russia is again fighting not only for itself, but also for the whole world, as President Vladimir Putin aptly put it. We believe that we need to pool our efforts so as, first of all, to develop the global majority's common approaches to how it should understand neocolonialism, and to complete the decolonization work launched by Soviet diplomacy at the UN. After all, 17 territories are still under colonial dependence, and the occupying countries will not liberate them despite the relevant UN resolutions. Last thing, your thoughts on that?
You know, the more that the Russia stands up against imperialism, the more it has to resuscitate and relate to the best aspects of its socialist Soviet past. And the fact that the Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, not only says that the Soviet example was inspiring, which is absolutely right, it was inspiring. And it was the thing, you know, the foundation of the Soviet Union was the thing that kicked off national liberation as a global movement. Without a doubt, it made national liberation struggle. It put heart and backbone into them, as well as giving them the practical solidarity I talked to you about earlier. He said the word again. So he is saying, we accept our connection to the Soviet Union. For a long time, they tried to pretend they didn't have any connection with the Soviet Union. Now they are physically identifying or practically identifying themselves. They're saying, yes, we will again do what the Soviet Union inspired people to do, bringing them together, working together, all the rest of it. So that's really, really significant, I think. It's quite fascinating for me. For a long time, my party have had an analysis that says, whatever its social system, Russia objectively is on the side of anti-imperialism. Doesn't even matter what its leaders say. Objectively, the things it's doing are hurting imperialism. And when the SMO was launched, we said the workers of the West need to understand that they have a side in this war. And Sergei Lavrov actually said that. He said, we are not only fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for humanity. That's exactly the line my party has been taking since the beginning of the SMO. The whole of humanity, progressive humanity, oppressed humanity, workers everywhere, including in the West. We need Russia to win because Russia is facing down the combined might of imperialism. And if it inflicts the defeat that we know we can see is coming now, that is a major blow to the power of the imperialists. And if they suffer these kind of blows, they become weaker, which makes our struggle more possible, right? We need our exploiters and oppressors to get weaker. That's why there's an absolute solid connection between our two struggles. And we in the imperialist countries need to work for the same thing they're working for. We need to work for a Russian victory, not just sit on the sidelines and go, wouldn't it be nice? We need to think of what can we do here that will accelerate that outcome, because it's in our interest. It's really in our interest, So just like we say about the Gaza genocide, because people are aware that that's a terrible crime and that our government's complicit, right? We say we shouldn't allow anybody to cooperate with any aspect of that genocide. It's the same with the NATO war in Ukraine against Russia. We call for, and every worker in the West should be calling for, a campaign of mass non-cooperation with the war effort of NATO against Russia in Ukraine. We need our imperialists to be defeated. It's a criminal, aggressive war by them. For Russia, it's a self-defense and a liberation war. And we need to be on Russia's side. We need Russia to win. So when Sergei Lavrov says, we are not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for humanity, I agree 100%.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would advise everyone to read, which I'm going to now, particularly having touched on those couple of passages. I'm going to read President Putin's speech. I'm going to read Sergei Lavrov's speech. It's obvious that they have taken a turn. It's kind of like a person who says, I know what to do if I get in this particular circumstances, right? I've been boating. I used to do search and rescue and all of that. And I've been out boating where someone's boat is broken down or they've had a problem. I said, let me tell you what we need to do. This, and this. Why? Because I used to do that, and I know boating and things like that, or the weather gets bad. Give me the wheel. Trust me, I know how to handle a boat in bad weather. I've done it, right? So I can revert back to the former skills that I used to have because I did that stuff, right? And I think that's what we're seeing with Russia. They're saying, look, this is not our first rodeo dealing with the imperialists. And we have the history and we have the tools. And we've been munching around the corners a little bit. But now we know that we have to reach back. We have to grab the toolkit that we know that works, and that we have to utilize that toolkit, bring it to the forefront. This is no longer about rhetoric, about communism. Let the West do that stuff physically, kinetically, diplomatically, rhetorically. We have to go back to what we know we have to have to protect ourselves from these madmen. What do you think? You get the last word.
Yeah, I think that's right, Garland. And you say that the Russians show a kind of calmness, and you see that from President Putin. You see it from Sergei Lavrov. You see it from most of their officials. They are not panicking. They are thoughtful and educated in history globally, in their own history. They understand how things work, and they are able to command and plan and strategize in an intelligent and in a calm, clear way. And that does bring back echoes of Joseph Stalin and the way that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ran the Second World War. They were incredibly calm while facing an apparently overwhelming enemy. They worked out what they needed to do, and they got on and they did it. And while they were doing it, they mobilized and motivated the people. The very motivating act of Stalin that shocked the West was that on the anniversary of the October Revolution in 1941, he wasn't hiding in a bunker and he wasn't evacuating from Moscow. He addressed the crowds. They held a rally, even though the guns were sort of at the gates of Moscow almost. The Hitler's guns had come very close to Moscow. They still held their celebration in Red Square on the 7th of November, and Stalin addressed them. And that speech went around the country and it electrified the people. And so this history of not just understanding how to plan and organize your forces and your defenses, and having built up that strategic depth and motivated but understanding, educated your people, understanding how to motivate them and bring them together, with a solid vision of what you're aiming at. Now, the leaders of Russia know that nothing brings the people of their territory together like Stalin does. And why was he such a great leader? He was ahead of a system that really genuinely benefited the people. I said to you, the people in World War II, the Soviet people, understood they were defending not only Russia, not only the USSR, but socialism and the future of humanity. They were fighting for all humanity. And I think it's not insignificant that Sergei Lavrov in his speech is echoing that sentiment which mobilized the mass of the Soviet people and made them such an impossible force to overcome.
I'll end by saying this. It's kind of like self-defense. If you're trained in self-defense, a person who's trained to fight, what do? You put your hands up. I don't want any trouble, sir. I don't want any trouble. What did the Putin say? Look, we don't want to fight. We don't want to. And he's a martial artist. Keep in mind, I don't want any trouble. But the person who is the angry street fighter, they're angry. Their jaws are clenched. I'm going to get you, right? And when that person faces a person and they become calm, because the person who's trained in self-defense, they know the importance of breathing, right? They're going to become calm. I don't want any trouble, but they're going to turn their body sideways now. I'm not going to give you a lot. They're saying, I don't want to fight, but if I have to fight, I have trained to do it, and you got a really nasty fight on your hands. And while they're calm, that calmness is, I'm looking at you. What are you doing? How is your breathing? Where are your hands? What is our distance? All of these things that automatically I know have to be in place in order for me. And it may come to a point where I say, there's no way around it. This person's going to attack me. I better strike first. Right? So it is a man. I always say, always remember, this guy's a martial artist. And he thinks like a martial artist. But what you're saying is anti-colonialism kind of aligns with the thoughts of martial arts, which is simple. It's self-defense. It's kinetic. It's self-defense. It's philosophical. How I want to avoid a fight. I'm looking at my enemy. I've done everything I can. I've said, can we get a deal? Can we work out? Can we not fight? And I realized that my enemy is not rational. They're angry and furious, and they're ready to fight. I am prepared for that. And what have I done? I've done sit-ups. I've done push-ups. I've practiced all of my strikes, the 5 elbow strikes. I know them. If you come near me, you're getting all 5 of them in 3 seconds. You know what I mean? All of these things, it is aligns with the thoughts of a martial artist who tries to avoid battle, but is prepared for battle and becomes the most calm. That's the calm and thoughtful and mindful when in fact a fight occurs. And everything they've done, like we talked about the Soviet Union, I've done these things 100 times before. I know what to do if you kick at me, if you strike at me, if you swing at me. I've done it all. It's muscle memory. To some extent, the Russian Federation has muscle memory from the legacy of the Soviet Union that they can revert back to if they need it. How can people follow you, follow all your wonderful works, etc.? Support you, all of those things.
I like the way you put that, Garland. So if you look down here, you can see the URL of my party's website, thecommunists.org. I highly recommend you guys take a visit to there. you can follow our output via our Telegram channel, which is The Communists. You can also follow me on Telegram, just me, Joti Brar. We're on Twitter and all of those things, but I like Telegram the best, and I encourage people to go to Telegram. You can also find our YouTube channel, which is called Proletarian TV. It's at Prol TV in YouTube.
Thank you very much. And as everybody knows, I'm on Twitter. You know, people always say, Garland, why would they throw you off X? You know, you're kind of a gentlemanly guy and you just try to discuss things. And I'm like, for some reason, such as shows such as this, they think I'm very dangerous to their project. At any rate, thanks a lot, Joti Brar. Thanks a lot, everyone. The Communists with an S. There's the Communist out there. There's one without the S now. I've seen that, right?
The state operation, Garland.
Makes sense, doesn't it? At any rate, make sure you have that S on the communist.org to follow Joti Brar. Everyone, you see everything going across the bottom, with the exception of Twitter. You see where to find me, where to follow me. And if you wanted to donate, that's fine. If not, just enjoy it. Share those on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much. We'll be back next week. I'm going to keep in touch with Joti. I'd like for us to review the speeches of particularly now Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, and I'd like to do a show, Joti. We'll talk to dissect those speeches. I think it's critical. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Got to run. Share this on all your social media platforms. Punch the old like button. You'll find that it is critical that you hit the like button. Peace. We're out.